My name is Michael Blight. I'm an assistant professor of communication and media at North Central College. And today, as part of this COVID webinar series, I will be talking about social media and misinformation. And so, to give you a brief overview to see if you actually want to watch and listen to the rest of this for the duration of the webinar session, I want you to know that this is primarily focused on what I'm considering to be three major talking points. Major talking point number one is the importance of language as it pertains to the spread, the manipulation, sometimes the control of what we decide to call as misinformation. The second one is the terms of service that has to do with social media. So when we're talking about you using any device, anything on the internet, your terms of service have a pretty profound impact on what you can and cannot post, what you can and cannot share or comment upon, and probably most importantly for this talk, how it is that decisions are made to restrict, report, and even sometimes terminate accounts when it comes to the internet. And the third and final talking point is this notion of the impact of platform changes. In other words, what is currently in place when it comes to how social media networks are changing and adapting to the current landscape of the spread of information, how to curb some of that, how to potentially eliminate it, although that probably will never happen. But probably more importantly, what are the active mechanisms in place now? What are the things that are being built by engineers to help stop the spread, whether it be algorithm changes, whether it be any information that needs to be curbed? So those are the three talking points. So as long as you agree to listen, you think those are important enough, welcome to the session. I'll take a couple of breaks for you to process and look at some things. I'll also make this PowerPoint available for you at a later time if you wanted to go reference any of the citations that I have, or to go back and just see and read the text. There are some moments here where I'll show a tweet, for instance, and sometimes it could be a little bit challenging as part of the flow of the presentation to just stop and have you read it. So you'll have all that information afterwards in real time. So if you ever need it, please just let me know. So talking point number one is the importance of language. Now, what I think is probably most important to note here is that I'm not making a claim in terms of the importance of language to suggest that something is or is not important. In other words, I am not a linguist. I don't pretend to be a linguist. I'm not saying that fake news versus false news has certain linguistic qualities to it. Similarly, I'm not a rhetorician. And so I'm not saying that the rhetoric, the political elements that exist when it comes to something being, quote, fake news is or is not correct. What I'm doing instead is saying that the language that we use is very important when it comes to talking about the spread of misinformation. And so the title of this slide should articulate the notion that we need to cast aside the accuracy of the language that's being used. In other words, we're not particularly interested if social distancing, to go to the second bullet point, if social distancing versus physical distancing is right or wrong. Because technically, this is why we're casting aside the linguistic principles, technically, with COVID, we need to physically distance ourselves from other people. As a communication scholar, I can tell you definitively that we, more than ever before, have had access to different types of social distancing than ever before. In other words, I get to connect with people via text message, via email. I get to rekindle old friendships because of my social interactions due to technology. I'm not socially distancing at all as a result of COVID. However, social distancing, because of the linguistic elements to it, is a term or a phrase rather, that people can understand to notice that they cannot be in a physical room with one another. They cannot socialize with one another, although as this is being recorded, some of those changes are being made widespread across Illinois. So the language matters. It matters in the way that we talk about the spread of misinformation. It also matters in terms of the way that the search engines and the algorithms pick up certain language. So very specific example, and I'll make it quick because I'll revisit it later. When it comes to things like informed consent versus anti-vax, the words, the language, the keystrokes that you make as you are typing have a profound impact on how misinformation is spread. Okay, so if we look at the third bullet point of something like all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter, there is some pretty important linguistic cues that exist here that change the overall substance of the message interpersonally. However, insert blank, lives matter still fundamentally changes the dynamic that the actual internet, that social media gets to see. As a matter of fact, what algorithms will eventually learn to do, and this is where things like machine learning comes into play, what they'll learn to do is they'll learn to feed you information, and they will cater it to you, very much so. They'll feed you information based on your viewing habits, based on your typing habits, based on your search habits. So all of those factors play into how we understand the world, which is why if you haven't opened up an incognito tab when browsing information that isn't necessarily pertinent to you, you might want to do that now, because otherwise you're going to get a bunch of targeted ads. You're going to get fed a bunch of information because of algorithms that you probably don't want. It is sort of the nefarious, sneaking component of the internet that not a lot of us are aware of right now. So we are casting the accuracy of the terms aside. We're pausing. We're saying, hang on. The actual right term, the correct term, almost doesn't matter when it comes to the spread of misinformation. As a matter of fact, as we go on to the next slide, when we talk about the naming conventions of this, using a term like Reopen America, as Carnegie Mellon has found out within their School of Computer Science, that almost half of the Twitter accounts that are discussing, that are participating actively in conversations about reopening America as of May of this year were actually bots. So what that means for us when it comes to the spreading of misinformation is that we see perceptively as a viewer of a device, whether it be your smartphone or your laptop or your desktop at home, we are seeing a huge proliferation of information. We're seeing huge engagement numbers when we see Donald Trump, for instance, tweet about reopening America. He tweets about reopening America. We see massive engagement. The numbers are through the roofs in terms of likes and retweets. They're inflated likes and retweets, according to Carnegie Mellon. And so what that means is that when we are seeing information in the trending section of our Twitter or Facebook or any other social media platform that you are frequently on, what really is happening is that we have a different inflated sense of the importance of the information. So as we are going through the rest of this webinar, what I really want you to focus on is how the information that we are seeing, the importance of the volume of likes, the importance of the engagement that we are observing, how that impacts the way that we understand what is accurate or not. Also, as an important side note, there are strategic naming conventions that exist. So what I'd like to do is quickly dismiss this idea that the naming of a lot of these sort of politicized hot topic issues, most of those are strategic. As an example, and I'll talk about this more in a second, the idea of vaccinations being a controversial statement, now we have, as part of the algorithm, as part of avoiding some of that, a number of social media agencies and platforms have decided to change and to filter out information regarding vaccines. For instance, this is a screenshot from YouTube. There is a video, as you can see listed here, pro-vaccine versus anti-vaccine. When I typed in vaccine onto YouTube, I received a prompt that led me to a clickable link to Wikipedia that gave me information about vaccine controversies. It talks about Wakefield and the debunked study. It talks about all the flubbed data when it comes to the linkage between vaccines and autism, as we know. And so the purpose of these new media technologies is to, anytime that something is flagged as vaccines, it will alert you, right? Very basic function. Vaccines or any information pertaining to vaccines, and we'll see this with COVID in a moment here, all of those will be flagged by the platform and will prompt you with information, right? It's just a basic reaction, basic Boolean coding. You type in a thing, you hit enter, it pumps out the information, but it also gives you an extra prompt as though you're seeing right here. The reason that this is important is because we can take that knowledge that we will be prompted to do or think or act in certain ways, and we can use that to avoid misinformation. We can use that to fuel and stoke the fires of misinformation. Again, let's dismiss the idea that none of this is strategic, that it's accidental, that certain things go viral and certain things are trending. In the case of vaccinations, as we talk about it right now, the main ingredient here is that the term anti-vaccine is not a particularly friendly term. Anti-vax, hashtag anti-vax. Not great. Most people do not want to be anti-anything. Sounds not great. Pro is good. Pro-vaccine. I am for vaccines. Anti-vaccine. I'm against vaccines. Well, what if we take the strategic naming convention and we say, I'm not actually against vaccines per se, even though you are. We'll get to that in a moment. I'm not against vaccines per se. I'm actually in favor of people making a choice whether or not they want to be vaccinated or not. Therefore, I will adopt the mantle. I will put on the hat of a informed consent advocate. Last year, I provided a tip talk for the political science department at North Central, and I talked almost exclusively about anti-vaxxers. My sentiment, again, here is that you can use the understanding of algorithms, you can use the understanding of information or lack thereof as a strategic tool. In the case of this naming convention, we can choose very specific language to either be flagged as something that pertains to, let's say, COVID or not at all. It's a major reason why Reopen America generates so much information, so much activity, because the bots can automatically identify the terms that are being used. They could search it out, they could find it, and they could automatically engage with it without anyone having to do anything. The bots are literally designed from the ground up by people, question mark as to who those people are, but they're designed from the ground up to find specific keywords and engage with it in a very specific way. Machine learning is coming a long way in the year 2020, and it is starting to be a little bit complex in terms of how we identify and even know it. We can talk about artificial intelligence and deep fakes at another point. But I just because talking about anti-vaccines, I figured naming is important, and we might as well have the correct name in place here. Okay, so far so good. You with me? We breathing? Taking a quick break. Lots of information. The takeaway of talking point number one is that's really important in terms of the way that we name things, the way that we call things. And again, most importantly, the way that our fingers touch the screen or the keys on our keyboard, because that information in the way and the order that it is presented directly impacts the searchability, the ability for a basic platform to find it, for a basic user to find it. If I type in hashtag Black Lives Matter on any social media platform, I will most likely be prompted with information about Black Lives Matter from the platform itself. That's a big deal. Talking point number two. And in some ways, I thought about swapping these talking points. Talking point number one being about this idea right here, which is the terms of service, the TOS, and the violations that go along with it in terms of social media. So when you are on, and I'll put up all these right here, when you are on a social media website, when you're creating an account, you are agreeing to the terms of service for that website. There are a number of implications. There are a bunch of rules that you cannot break, and if you do break them, bad things happen. There are instances, in the case of, let's say, 8chan right here, wherein platforms are offline for a bit of time and they're back online. And what we find is that there aren't, other than the major conglomerations like a Facebook who owns Instagram, a Twitter, a Pinterest, a Snapchat, now a TikTok, there are a number of websites that come and go that have provided historically, in the case of 8chan, have provided an outlet for people to not have to abide by specific terms of service. So when we think about the world that we live in now when it comes to terms of service, there are violations that exist and things that you can and cannot do. In the case of Katie Hopkins, she, as of, I believe, 6/19/2020, has been permanently suspended from Twitter for violating its hateful conduct policy. I have a little bit of that in a moment here, but you can look it up. Enough violations will get you a permanent ban. The reason that she is permanently banned is not overtly because she is spreading misinformation. It's that she is spreading misinformation and she has been reported and flagged as spreading information, and she has violated its hateful conduct policy. She at one point referred to a final decision, which we know has historical implications latent within that. To the right, I guess, depending on which side of the screen you're looking at, you will see the top replies to the BBC News tweet. And these, in some ways, when it comes to misinformation, this is a highlight, this is an underpin that users like Green Flower or Barsky or Carol are looking at the BBC, who is simply reporting this information on a platform like Twitter, and those people are automatically replying with this notion that the information is actually this idea of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, or information or misinformation is actually non-existent. That there's this restrictive platform that only favors one side, which is the left. left. Okay, so politics aside, there is a growing sort of a resounding understanding that there are major criticisms that exist when it comes to how we view people and their political affiliation as it pertains to violations of the terms of service. So when you're signing up for an account on Twitter, you're agreeing to a number of different rules and contexts that exist here. This is the dangerous, a quick shift, a pivot, if you will. This is the dangerous individuals and organizations language from the terms of service on Facebook. And what you can see here is that these are the protected bits of information. These are the groups of people, the groups of activities that you cannot participate in. You cannot participate in any sort of terrorism activity, as they describe it. You cannot participate in what they describe as quote unquote organized hate. TBD if that upholds in a lot of ways, talking about mass murder, talking about human trafficking, organized violence or criminal activity. And so you'll see a lot within the terms of services. They mirror each other very much. You'll see a lot of repeated information, which is to say that when we're looking at the terms of service that a user will sign and agree to, what we really should be looking at is how does that individual understand and interpret their role to play in the spreading of information. So for instance, there are a lot of people, and I will not, for the sake of fueling the fire, let's just say that, I will not give you their account information, but you can find a lot of people who are making questionable tweets, questionable Facebook statuses that teeter pretty close to organized hate, that are in a lot of ways alt-right, in some ways are very prejudiced statuses, and they're not found in direct violation of the terms of service. And so we can share and spread that misinformation unless it gets flagged enough times and gets actually taken down. As a matter of fact, the reason that I bring that up, and you'll see in a moment here, the reason I bring that up is that there has to be a litmus test when it comes to what a platform is willing to sort of tolerate when it comes to the spreading and distribution of misinformation. Now, in this case, this is from the Washington Post, it's not listed here. In this case, Facebook recently removed a Trump advertisement from Team Trump, a sponsored Trump Make America Great Again sponsored post, wherein they utilized a symbol, this inverse triangle, that was once used by Nazis as part of a way to designate a political prisoner in the 1940s. And this is, as some have argued and will continue to argue, I'm sure, this is not a coincidence that this imagery, this symbolism has been used before. It is not a coincidence that the reoccurring threat of Trump using, let's say, certain ideologies is maybe being repeated, and that some of the supporters are aligned with this notion of a purist society that only looks homogenized in one way. Okay, I'll let the political scientists walk you through that. I'm not at all qualified to go through the full spectrum of that information. But what I can tell you is that when it comes to the spreading of misinformation, Facebook nips it in the bud because it uses symbolism and language that is in direct violation of the terms of service. You have agreed to it, Team Trump, who paid to have this ad sponsored. And just in case you cannot read it, I'll read you just the first little bit of text. Dangerous mobs of far left groups are running through our streets and causing absolute mayhem. They are destroying our cities and rioting. It's absolute madness. It's important that every American comes together at a time like this to send a united message that will not tolerate blah, blah, blah. Okay, so Facebook sees this, direct violation, pretty straightforward. Hate group, take it down. Flagged, taken down, done. Now, important, is the ultimate boomerang effect when it comes to the spread of misinformation. Well, you would think somebody who supports Team Trump, and I'm sure this is a line of thinking that exists somewhere, well, I don't understand. Do we not have freedom of expression when it comes to using this platform? They're not using that symbolism. That's not what they meant with that. People are so sensitive, and of course, the far left, let's go back. Of course, the far left, huzzah. They're saying far worse. We just happen to use a triangle. Oh, so what? Now, what has happened functionally is that people are taking this story and this is the ultimate meta level thinking of spreading of misinformation. They are taking the story of the post being removed and they are sharing that as an example to perpetuate the notion of misinformation. Hey, talk about censorship. We can't even have these sponsored targeted ads anymore. Spreading of information. Look at this news article from the Washington Post. How biased could they possibly be? Share this angry emoji, angry emoji, angry emoji, swearing emoji, angry emoji, right? So there is this really unique sense of if we put out this story for people to know and to share, we have to be cognizant of the sharing of misinformation playing a pretty critical role in the way that we understand how the communicative affect actually happens. In other words, when we are seeing and sharing this story, are we participating in an echo chamber wherein the misinformation only goes into a certain collection, a certain pocket of people who most likely agree with us? Recently, as of, I believe, April of 2017, Facebook put out a post from their VP that is titled "Working to Stop Misinformation," very pertinent naming for this webinar, and false news. And I don't think that any of us would be too far stretched to think of why they used a term like false news versus fake news. Seeing as though fake news is sort of the major platform that somebody like Donald Trump uses. And so Facebook takes a stance against misinformation and the spread of it and false news. Okay? Not fake, false. Again, language, very important. Because if you type in hashtag false news, you get something different in the algorithm. And you can do it. I've done it. The reason that I bring this up and this notion of the spreading of misinformation is that when we think about this notion of false news, we think about as Adam, the VP of Facebook, says, we know people want to see accurate information on Facebook. The problem ultimately is that people don't agree on what the term accurate means. What is accurate? What is the source of the accuracy? And how do we know that they're accurate? What is the falsehood that exists there? Okay. Moving on past that, talking point number 3 is the important impact of the platform changes, or what I tentatively wanted to call this slide, which is, what the heck are they, being the social media platforms, what the heck are they doing about all this information, about the spread of misinformation? What in the world is going to happen? Very brief water break. And so the answer looks a little bit like this. Algorithms that are designed to directly combat information. Let's revisit the vaccine argument. Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, as I showed you before with YouTube, Wikipedia, I'm sure a number of other platforms are using similar technologies to catch this, is that any time that somebody types in vaccinations, that individual, that end user who's accessing the device, who is typing the information, is immediately prompted with a link, a redirecting link that then takes them to new information. And the idea is that in order to combat the spread of misinformation, we are going to restrict it. Okay, so anytime that somebody posts something that is anti-vax, anti-science, if you will, we're going to flag it, we're going to take it down. And the people who are searching for that information, unbeknownst to them, it's been taken down because of the reporting function, we are going to redirect those people. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach. Eliminate the content that's there to avoid the spread of misinformation, potentially dangerous anti-science, anti-humanity information. We're going to restrict it. We're going to remove it. Gone. No ifs, ands, or buts. If it's anti-science, anti-vaccines, it's gone. And then, as people are searching that, because the search function, despite popular belief, other than your feed, people actively seek out, solicit information, right? They have curiosities. They have a child. They've heard through the mommy blogs potentially that vaccines are maybe not the best thing in the world. If it doesn't organically come through their feed because of targeted advertisements of organic and all natural supplements to avoid vaccines and boost your immune system, then people will search it. And we know that that is a considerable function and action that people take. It's not simply that people are just fed information organically. Instead, what happens is that people search out information, the machine learning finds that they are looking up that information, and the cycle begins to continue and progress. Probably more importantly than this idea of misinformation and the algorithms to combat that is this notion of, and just to reillustrate this idea, is trying to make sure that the conspiracy type videos, using the Joe Rogan podcast as an example, the conspiracy type of videos that are flagged as having certain high topic health related information are, again, redirecting people to do the quote right and wrong thing. But also, what's particularly fascinating is that a number of these platforms have taken a stance against controversial information. However, there is a wide range as to what is considered controversial. In other words, I will give you an example. You can search on YouTube if you so desire. If you want to be anti-science, I will encourage you to do this just for the sake of the activity. It is the teacher mind in me. You can search on YouTube flat Earth. Okay, the Earth is not flat. It just isn't. It is a conspiracy theory. You could search flat Earth. You could search JFK assassination. You can get books on both of those things. And you will not be redirected to information about the truth of either of those things. However, it has been the decision of these platforms, which begs the question of when do we start versus stop provide information? It is the decision to flag certain content, vaccines, COVID, and in those moments to find the redirect. So the power in a lot of ways, and this is the burden of responsibility these platforms have to take on, is that they have to dictate what information gets flagged within the algorithms and how do we redirect people in an effective way. And all those things considered, it does start to beg the question of how much power do these individuals have if these evil machine learning algorithms are spitting out content for us to consume. Why is it that they are only choosing specific bits of information to control and functionally manipulate? Now that is a conspiracy theory. Also, in terms of things that social media platforms are doing, if you can consider YouTube to be a social media platform, I know they like to think of themselves as that, although I don't know that people use that function as much. Twitter, for instance, is holding up its terms of service, but only sometimes. In other words, when Twitter decides when somebody is in violation of terms and service, as you can see here, this tweet violated the Twitter's rules about glorifying violence. However, Twitter has determined that it may be in the public's interest for the tweet to remain accessible. Now we have asterisks next to the spread of potentially harmful information, for instance, glorifying violence. Twitter has decided that, you know what, we're not going to use the terms of service that everyone has agreed to. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to flag it and say, hey, just as fair warning, you can view this, but it is in violation. If anyone else gets reported, we're going to report them. We're going to temporarily, maybe permanently take down their account. But because of the public's interest, we're going to have it remain accessible. Okay. So there are weird gray and moral dilemmas that exist when it comes to what are the grounds for restricting information. And for the record, if you're less familiar with the story, Donald Trump was talking about this idea of looting and then the shooting starts, right? In direct reference. So that's questionable. Just to give you a heads up as to what this process looks like, to really hammer home this idea of how somebody could go about reporting and flagging a specific type of video. What's really important to note, and this is the screen that looks, if you click on Twitter, you click a tweet, you click the drop-down menu, and you click report, this is what you see. The basic idea is that this is suspicious, it doesn't feel right, it's abusive, it's misleading. That's a fun one. It expresses intentions of self-harm or suicide. When you click learn more and you look at the terms of service, and just put this side by side to really beat a dead horse when it comes to the partial restriction, but not upholding of the terms of service when it comes to the glorifying violence tweet. If you look at a side-by-side comparison of the safety clause and the authenticity clause on something like Twitter, and under the authenticity clause, there's something that is called civic integrity, which is manipulating or interfering in elections or other civic processes. Rioting and protesting, I would argue, would be civic integrity. Couple that with something like, let's say, violence. You may not threaten violence against an individual or a group of people. We also prohibit the glorification of violence. Learn more about our violent threat and glorification of violence policies. We have found this person in direct violation of our safety subheading violence. Okay. It also If we're doing the sort of a parallel, we're also saying that this might not be authentic in terms of the integrity that a civic leader might have. But you know what? We're going to keep it up there. We're just going to hide it behind this little viewable click button, and then you could see it. And you could share it. And therein lies the problem with the spreading of misinformation and the spreading and glorification of glorifying violence, in that the platforms themselves get to dictate functionally who gets to keep their voice. And in some of these instances, they don't take a stance as to what information can or cannot be involved. As a matter of fact, Mark Zuckerberg has been heavily criticized to the point that a significant number of people have left the company, that being Facebook, in a result of his lack of upholding their terms of service. That it's now at a point where we don't know exactly how all the terms of service works uniformly across an entire group of people. And so for that reason, and for that reason alone, we start to think about this idea of how do we reconcile this notion of when something is in violation of the terms of service, what is the punishment? And how is it that I go about reporting it to stop the spread of misinformation? And if I cannot successfully stop the spread of misinformation, then why do I have the terms of service at all? If we take down 8chan because it was a platform that was used by school shooters, it was a platform used by mass shooters, and we decided that them talking about shooting people and the plan and the organization that was going to incite more violence, is going to create copycats who see it, we're going to take that down, and that's bad. You shouldn't do it. But if a president or anyone, a high-ranking official, glorifies violence in direct opposition of our terms of service, grossly misinforms the public as to what the appropriate course of action is, incites violence for the people to see, that, we're going to keep it. We're going to say that it's not the best. We're going to say, hey, you broke the rules. But if you click view, you can see it. And you can still retweet it, and you can still share it, and you can still like it, and you can still have it as a screenshot and post it and cross-post it on another platform. And that's the beauty of the algorithms, that most of them don't have the capacity yet to search the actual text of a screenshot of an image. If it's a copy and paste of text, it can come up within the filter. If it's a screenshot of an image, you can see the image and read the text on the image, but the algorithm cannot. The spread of misinformation is rampant. It's also inconsistent. And for that, I bid you adieu with the final concluding remark. If the terms of service have gray areas and they have wiggle room, what does that mean for us as citizens? How do we go about actively participating as civically engaged users? How is it that we have the capacity and have the likelihood to be permanently removed from a platform if other people with more power, with more status, with a pretty cool title like president, how is it that those people do not get the boot? Thanks for listening to my webinar, and hope to talk to you soon.